Some interesting and it's seemingly positive economic news coming down the pike this week that we wanted to make sure to talk about. And joining me to do that is Washington Bureau Chief for Bankrate, Mark Hamrick, good friend of the podcast. You see him on Faith Nation all the time. So, Mark, welcome back to the DC Debrief. How are you?
Great to be with you. I'm doing well. I hope you are and get the sense you are as well, John. Thank you.
Well, if I'm not, I fake it anyway, so that's good news.
It's important. Yeah.
Well, I think that I was surprised this week when seeing some of the financial data come down. We had some inflation numbers come down this week. We had some retail sale numbers come down this week, which I want to get into in a second. But very interesting comments by the Fed chair on Wednesday, talking about the fact that they're going to leave interest rates where they are for the rest of the year. And looking ahead to next year, we're looking at rate cuts for next year. So seemingly, this is, if I'm reading between the tea leaves, Mark, but I want you to make sure that I'm reading this correctly. They're more bullish on the state of the economy now over the next 12 months. Is that your sense as well?
I think that's a fair way to characterize it. Let's sort of back up just a little bit and talk a little bit about where we've been and how we might have gotten to where we think we might be, leaving aside where we might be going. So, looking at, let's say, some of my social media timelines, it's increasingly shocking to me that we're talking about right now being in sort of a 4-year anniversary of the time before we knew the pandemic was going to make such a serious dent in our lives and taking the lives of many people and all the economic implications of that. And so it's been quite the journey, to say the least. And many things that happened that we couldn't really have predicted. And part of that was historically high inflation. And what resulted was the Federal Reserve response, raising interest rates by the most in a generation. And here we are in the Christmas season. Kind of looking back from an economic analysis standpoint and kind of scratching our heads and saying, it's amazing that the economy has remained as resilient as it has. And as you and I speak, the stock market is off to the races with a 20% plus gain this year, putting the Dow Industrials average at a new record high. The unemployment rate at 3.7%, much lower than would have been expected when you have the federal funds rate, the benchmark interest rate set by the Fed, as high as it is. The fact that we had a mini banking crisis earlier this year. And so, it's just been a much more positive outcome for this moment in time, leaving aside that we don't know what happens tomorrow. And so the Fed had to acknowledge that. It had to acknowledge that inflation has come down much more substantially than it and pretty much everybody else expected, that the job market is in a better place from any number of different perspectives, better balance, as Fed Chairman Powell likes to say. So if we didn't give thanks over the Thanksgiving season, maybe it's a time to say our prayers here for additional reasons over the holiday and Christmas seasons.
How do you explain that the economy was able to navigate these waters? Because you mentioned a number of headwinds really since the pandemic and the inflation numbers that were so high a year ago that they have come down, but still things cost more now than they did a year ago, and people are still feeling that. So there was a lot of talk at the beginning of the year about a possible recession. It certainly seems as if we have avoided that fate. I don't know that for sure. You would know that better than I would. But how did we manage to avoid a catastrophe?
Well, I think I was thinking about the questions that I wasn't able to ask Chairman Powell at the news conference. And one, if I wanted to be a little bit humorous, would have been, do you feel lucky or smart or some combination thereof? Because I do think it's some of all the above, good fortune in a sense. But, there was so much done to try to keep the economy from literally going into a depression. When, you had a Treasury Secretary under the previous administration talking about the possibility that the unemployment rate could go to 25% in those early days of the pandemic. And so, we had members of both parties and two different presidents who were quite astonishingly different, all really sort of bring out the heavy ammunition to assist the economy. And I think that that did provide more momentum than probably we even now currently appreciate. There have been things done since that, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure and Chips Acts, some of which is controversial, and the impacts of those will be, analyzed and debated for years to come. And of course, the Federal Reserve, while late to the party in the sense of raising rates to try to bring inflation down, you have to say that all those things seem to have worked. Now, one of the I think comments that might have gone in a sense unnoticed at the news conference that Chairman Powell held was sort of along the lines of what you're referencing there with recession. And let me set that up by saying, we survey economists every quarter at Bankrate, and beginning in the first quarter of 2022, they were talking about a heightened risk of recession that now we've sort of been, powering through for about 2 years. And Chairman Powell at the news conference said he thinks that right now there is not a recession. And what he's sort of referencing there is we had historically high growth in the third quarter, 5.2%. That's sort of twice plus the typical average. But that growth rate is seen sort of waning a bit here in the current quarter. And then it remains to be seen what happens next year. But, it's just been a remarkable turn of events. And, that sets us up very nicely for 2024 in the sense of we go into the year with a number of things lining up in a positive way. And one of the things that's sort of a little more wonky, but very noteworthy, is that we've had an incredible decline in bond market yields that's coincided with the stock market rally. And people say, why should I care? It's because those yields set the groundwork, or essentially are the things that correlate to, for example, lower mortgage rates. And so we're seeing mortgage rates fall very sharply here. And that's going to help the housing market if that could be sustained.
Well, that would be a big deal because I know it has been very tough to buy a house. Those interest rates much higher than people have been used to, really in a generation. Because they used to be much higher and they came down really low for a while. So that's welcome news. And so we're talking about prices. There are still some things that are hitting the pocketbook pretty hard. Many things that are hitting the pocketbook pretty hard. But with the latest inflation numbers that have come out recently, where do you still see the pressure points, and where do you see things have eased up in terms of prices?
Well, one thing I want to level set here about, John, is to associate myself with the many Americans, the majority of Americans, who sort of express that inflation has really been bad for their personal finances and their households overall, and to bring sort of a data point to show that, maybe more than one, is that coming into the most recent Consumer Price Index report, prices were essentially up 20% from pre-pandemic levels. Okay, we tend to look at the year over year, which recently has been, closer to 3%. But if you think about the fact that you had 20% of your buying power destroyed, that would be associated with really typically sort of, catastrophic economic developments. And so we get some pushback from time to time from people when we're sort of zeroing in on the job market, where we say, well, the job market remains historically strong, and people are more sort of grounded in the inflation piece. And so, they sort of either take issue with that or resent it. And I understand that, because this inflation experience has been kind of a miserable one. But having said that, those inflation pressures have really begun to moderate. And the expectation is that we'll see that continue next year, perhaps even at a more favorable level than what had been expected. So all that, I think, is pretty good news. And the most important thing, of course, or maybe you'll think, of course, after I tell you, and that is that the gasoline prices, posted a 6% decline in November, and energy prices more broadly are down. And so if there's one thing that sets people off and really weighs on consumer sentiment, it's gasoline prices. And so seeing them now at the lowest levels of the year, that's a big deal.
Yeah, here in where I live in Northern Virginia, down below $3 a gallon in a number of different places, which is that's always kind of the marker for me. Is gas prices are good. It's got a 2 in front of it, so that's usually a good sign that gas prices, energy prices are doing well. So we saw Americans also continuing to spend last month. The latest consumer confidence numbers, the consumer spending numbers are out, and again showing that despite the inflation, despite the hit that it's taking on the pocketbook, the American people are still spending, aren't they?
They are, and I think, the numbers we have so far, which are just through the month of November, end up being better than had been expected by this point. I think the gasoline price part does help with that, where people can focus a little bit more on discretionary purchases than what is absolutely necessary. Some of the areas where we're seeing strength, bars and restaurants, people are going out and eating and drinking. They are spending more on things like sporting goods, and we're seeing online sales robust, which that's continued to gain market share. Let's say over the intermediate past. So we'll see how December ends up, but the National Retail Federation has predicted a year-over-year gain of somewhere between 3 and 4%, and we're tracking on the high side of that right now. I do
Mhm.
worry that maybe too many people are weighing or leaning forward on credit card debt to finance some of these purchases when we have the average rate for the best qualified new users of credit cards or those who would be getting applications or offers. Those are roughly at 20 and 3/4%, meaning there's plenty of people that have much higher rates than that. And so the risk is you have a holiday shopping spree that then is followed by a New Year's debt hangover. And, we'd counsel against that. Credit cards are great to use, but you really do need to pay those balances off before that interest rate charge hits.
Last thing for you here, Mark. In general, if you can just kind of broad paint picture for us here, how would you describe the economy as we head into 2024?
It's proven much more resilient than we would have thought by now. It's in a much better place than we would have thought by now. The fact that we've had yields in the bond market coming down, the expectation that the Federal Reserve will feel comfortable cutting rates in 2024. I think ultimately the phrase is we're in a better place than we thought we'd be by now. So another reason to count our blessings.
Well, you can read everything that the very, very smart folks at Bankrate are saying about the economy over at bankrate.com. And that's where you can find all of Mark Hamrick's work as well. Mark, thank you for coming back on the DC Debrief. We'll talk to you again down the road.
Much appreciated, John. Thanks so much. Good to talk to you.